Hello and welcome to the Week in 60 Minutes, brought to you by SpectatorTV and broadcast on Thursday, January 6th. I'm Cindy Yu, the Spectator's broadcast editor. On the show, do vaccine passports work or should we rip them up? Kate Andrews says the experiment needs to end and will be on the show with Kirsty Innes from the Tony Blair Institute. England seems to have dodged lockdown, but are Boris Johnson's fraught relations with his party and cabinet any better as a cost of living crisis looms? I'll be speaking to Isabel Hardman. Nyrola Elimä writes in this week's magazine about life as a Uyghur in China. She has now left, but tells me about the imprisonment of her cousin and how her parents are under house arrest. Yet the state frequently wheels out her mother in propaganda videos showing how good life is in Xinjiang. She'll be on the show. In a column this week, Lionel Shriver says we have an unhealthy dependency on imagining impending doom. Do we worry too much? I'll be speaking to Lionel. And finally, at a Broadway production in New York last week, the actor Hugh Jackman praised the understudies and covers who sometimes learn as many as 10 parts in a play in case an actor can't make a show. Who are these unsung heroes of theatre? Jenna Innes from Les Mis and Rachel Rawlinson from Six will join us. Before we get going, if you enjoy Spectator TV, do remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the red subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon to make sure you never miss an episode. And why not subscribe to the Spectator magazine too? You can get 12 weeks of the magazine, in print and online, along with a £20 Amazon voucher for just £12. Just go to spectator.co.uk/TV offer to take it up. Yesterday, Boris Johnson announced that Plan B COVID measures, that stay-at-home guidance, masks on public transport and vaccine passports will remain for another 3 weeks. In this week's cover piece, Kate Andrews says the pass scheme needs to be stopped. Kate joins me now to explain her argument and to make the case for vaccine passports. Kirsty Innes, Director of Digital Government Unit at the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change, is also on the show. So, Kate, you went home just after Christmas to see your family in America, but it wasn't without difficulty. Can you tell us what happened?
So as I was headed to the airport, I went to download my travel pass, my vaccine passport, through a technology that we were promised would never become a vaccine passport, but that is, of course, what it is now. And I discovered that my record wasn't there. It said that my COVID record couldn't be found. I then clicked on my domestic vaccine passport, and I got a notice saying that I had had a positive PCR test, which was true. I was delayed in going home because I, unfortunately, like many people out there, got COVID before Christmas, and because of that my app was suspended. My vaccine passport was suspended for 10 days from when I tested positive on the PCR. Now this was temporarily very worrying because I thought my travel plans were busted again. As it turns out, because I'm an American citizen, that's the one country essentially I could travel to without evidence of my vaccine status. Had I been going anywhere else, I probably would have been grounded. But also the information was very odd to me and conflicting because in this country you don't isolate from when you get a positive PCR test, you isolate from when you first get your symptoms. So it didn't add up with the rules. And whilst once I dug into the fine print of government guidance, it turns out that this is how the app works. I don't think many people out there know that at the push of a button or the registration of a PCR test, your vaccine passport can be suspended. And the truth is this technology is far more powerful than politicians want to admit, and it turns out quite hard to control. I think so far this experiment of vaccine passports has highlighted a lot of the negatives, and we've seen very few of the positive things that the arguments around vaccine passports say you're going to get out of the scheme. I don't think it's too late to ditch it, and I think at the end of the month, if MPs are asked to vote again, we shouldn't just suspend domestic vaccine passports, we should be abolishing them for good.
Now, Kirsty, what happened to Kate seems like a glitch, essentially, because she was on day 12 of her isolation, but the COVID pass hadn't been updated in order to reflect that, and that meant that potentially she couldn't leave the country. But even so, even if it's not intended to have happened, this is the problem with the vaccine passport, isn't it? That it gives a government the power to limit certain actions, and a government that often is not less than competent.
Well, what happened to Kate sounds awful and certainly shouldn't have happened. I think if the government's going to offer this service, they've got to make sure it works. And absolutely, the vaccine passport should be in line with the current recommendations and guidance. So, yeah, that's a really bad glitch. But I think the good news is with the digital passport, that would have been relatively easy to fix and update so that the app does work in line with whatever the current restrictions are. Probably much easier than a more analog system where you've got people administering guidelines themselves and having to update a whole team of people who are doing this rather than looking at an app. But having said that, I think that one person's bad experience or one glitch doesn't undermine the value of the tool as a whole, which we have to look at as part of the whole society-wide, government-wide response to what is a global health emergency. The question is, if we think we need to take steps to limit the spread of COVID around society, how are we going to do that in the most targeted, proportional way possible? Are we going to have measures that affect everyone, like a blanket lockdown or blanket ban of some activities or blanket travel bans, as we've seen with many countries imposing restrictions on people who can travel based on where they're coming from? Or are we going to use technology to make that as smart as we can and just restrict it for people who we know are at an increased risk of having or transmitting the disease?
Kate, what would you say to that?
So to be clear, it wasn't a glitch. This is how the app works, and if you dig into the guidance, it decides to suspend your vaccine passport from after you test positive for that PCR. Now, again, I don't think MPs were aware that this is the way that the technology worked when they voted on it. I don't think any of this is democratic, but it isn't a mistake. It isn't one person's bad experience. There will be countless people over Christmas and since who will have discovered that actually, because of a technology that's already gotten out of the hands of the state, their movements are restricted. The way that they can go about living their lives is restricted, and there's no appeal process here. There's no number you can call. It's just computer says no, and all of a sudden your rights as an individual are suspended. And I think this is the inevitable outcome of something like a vaccine passport. You know, I don't think governments are, generally speaking, competent enough to control such a thing. But even if they were, we should all be very seriously concerned that the government would have a technology that could, at the click of a button, suspend the way we're going about our lives. And I think that the reason we can have this debate in the UK, and you know, a really honest and good debate about it, is that thankfully, compared to a lot of other countries out there, we don't have the same kind of vaccine hesitancy problem. We have one of the best booster uptakes in the world so far. We have an incredible vaccine rollout program. And for those who still don't want to get vaccinated, we need better education programs to explain why we need to do this. But broadly speaking, this is a country that wants to be vaccinated. And one of the benefits of our incredible success is that we shouldn't need this kind of technology to try to use essentially a digital stick to beat those who aren't compliant into doing what we want. Because, by the way, that doesn't seem to work in the UK. Some countries with relatively low vaccine uptake have seen that implementing vaccine passports has led to more people getting the jab. But here in the UK, when Scotland brought in vaccine passports, their jab rate was still in line with England that didn't have it. We're not seeing any of the so-called benefits that people said we would get out of vaccine passports. We're just seeing the bureaucracy, and frankly, we're seeing an erosion of the rights and liberties that we really cannot take for granted in the UK. They're so fundamental and important, and I think this is the time that we need to re-seize them before this kind of activity and this kind of technology becomes normalized.
Now, Kirsty, on vaccine hesitancy, what do you make of that? Because Chris Whitty, the Chief Medical Officer, is privately saying that he's worried about what vaccine passports do to vaccine hesitancy. What do you guys at the Tony Blair Institute think about that potential conflict?
Yeah, I think it's something that you need to pay really close attention to. So health passes have got two ways they help to reduce COVID. One is by reducing transmission, because if you're sure that everyone in a particular space has either had their full vaccination or has a recent negative test, then you can reduce the amount of transmission within that venue. And the government's leaked research said it could be by as much as 40 to 45%. And the second way is by providing people with a nudge or an incentive to get their vaccine and or to have that test. Obviously, the evidence around how it impacts people in terms of their willingness to take the vaccine is really mixed, and it's going to be different for different populations. There will be some people for whom they haven't got around to doing it, they don't see the benefit for them, they don't see the point, it just hasn't been part of what they've been doing, for whom needing to have a vaccine passport to go clubbing or to do something will be enough to say, okay, I'll go and get it. There'll be some for whom the reasons for not getting vaccinated are much more complicated and much more sort of deeply felt, and to reach those people you need a much smarter and broader range of mechanisms. Nobody's arguing that you shouldn't be using the full suite of tools to get to that population, from information campaigns, making it much more easily accessible, sharing the evidence and helping to reach communities who understandably have a real trust issue with government and with health services. So it's really complicated, but there are at least 2 ways in which health passes can help us tackle COVID, and I think that for that reason we shouldn't be ignoring them. And can I just come back on the point about competence for governments? I find it really depressing when people say we shouldn't be using this or that technical tool because the government isn't competent to do it. The problem with that is not the technology, it's the government being competent. They must be competent, they should be competent to use these kind of things, and otherwise it sends a very sad signal about what services we can expect from the government and how we can expect them to look after the population and provide public services to us as we go forward and technology evolves even further.
Well, Kirsty, one of the points that Kate makes in her piece is this point about disenfranchisement. And maybe actually, Kate, you should make this point, because Kirsty there is talking about those who mistrust government. But I guess the point is that if you have vaccine passports, those who mistrust government are then denied services and hospitality and access to places.
So I think this point about mistrust in government, I'll start that again. I think this point about distrust in government is a really important one, because when we think about people who don't want to get vaxxed, we often think about very middle class people who are, doing it for extremely selfish reasons. And, frankly, those people do exist. But the figures that the politicians are really, really loath to talk about, but we highlight in the Spectator this week, are the ethnicity gaps in vaccine take-up and the wealth gap in vaccine take-up. It's something like 11% of the rich haven't had their vaccine, but nearly, I think, over a quarter of the poorest in society haven't had their vaccine. And, there are deep-bedded social reasons for this. And I don't think that the implementation of vaccine passports, again, we haven't seen any evidence in the UK that the implementation of vaccine passports is helping those groups, often minority groups, often those who are more vulnerable in society, to take up their jabs. We need a much more thoughtful and a better education campaign around this. I want to pick up on that point about transmission, because I think the Omicron variant has just completely decimated the argument around transmission in favor of vaccine passports. So with this new variant, the vaccines are still doing incredible work. They're protecting us against severe illness. That is the most important reason to get your vaccine. It's the best reason to get your vaccine. The boosters are also working miracles. The vaccines are still having great effect. But the Omicron variant does seem to quite successfully get around infection. Vaccines are not as protective as they once were when it comes to Omicron, especially there's a lot of evidence that AstraZeneca, for example, 2 jabs of that, which would get you a vaccine passport, is not stopping you from getting this virus or from transmitting it. It is hopefully stopping you from going to hospital. But this idea that if you're double jabbed with AstraZeneca and you're in a vaccine passport venue now, you are somehow less of a risk to others. Omicron has dented that argument quite a lot. And I just think that the benefits that we said we were going to get from vaccine passports have not appeared in the UK, but we see problems with the technology. We see government that can't control it. And yes, I suppose in your dream world, governments would be always thoughtful and capable of controlling these things, but history would suggest that they very, very rarely are, and I highly doubt that any government that's going to come along in the near future is necessarily going to change that. Basically, don't rely on that. Look at the technology and think, we're getting a glimpse into what government could control and how well they could do it. And if you don't like what you're seeing in that glimpse, and I certainly don't, then this is going to be the time to change it, because MPs at the end of the month may well have another opportunity to vote. And the benefits that we've gotten from the vaccine should mean that this real push for vaccine passports to prove your health status when you want to go about your business and live your life can be tossed out the window, because living with COVID has meant vaccines, it's meant testing, it's meant antivirals, but it really hasn't meant vaccine passports. These have been getting in the way, frankly, I think, of a broader educational conversation we need to have with people about why they need to take up their vaccines. It's politicizing the vaccines, and Cindy, as you started to hint at, even the chief medical officer, Chris Whitty, is very concerned behind closed doors about what this is doing to our public debate around vaccines. They should always be seen as an attractive feature, because scare tactics very rarely work. And there could be real implications for if we politicize vaccines in this way, what that means for future vaccination campaigns, especially the core vaccines that we need to help protect children. So, the evidence so far does not stack up in favor of vaccine passports. We have that very rare opportunity where something isn't embedded in society to actually say, no, we reject this, we've had the experiment, it's failed, and we're going to go in a different, more liberal direction. And thanks to the vaccines, frankly, we can do that.
Well, Kirsty, what do you say to that Omicron changes the game, firstly, but also secondly, that there's some people who just will never get the vaccine, they just simply don't want to, but if you implement some kind of passport system, then that means that they essentially become second-class citizens?
I wouldn't agree with that at all. I mean, Omicron does change the game, but the fact that it's more transmissible means we need to do all the more to reduce transmission. You won't ever get to an absolute stage where you can guarantee that everyone in a venue is free of COVID or that you're reducing transmission to zero, but you can reduce it, and that's what you should do. In terms of the equity point, I think the stats on the Black and minority ethnic community take-up rates are seriously concerning, and the social demographic take-up rates are a real worry. But the worry is that these people are vastly increased risk of getting seriously ill, dying, going into hospital, or getting long COVID, not that they'll have to take a lateral flow test if they want to go to a club. To me, that seems like a very small part of the problem indeed. I just wanted to mention something in Kate's piece that I really agreed with, which is it's great that there is a democratic process in action here. I think new bits of technology and new tools like this should always be subject to trials, piloting, broad public consultation. I think it's great that there's a sunset clause and there is opportunities to have a debate in Parliament about how this is working. But what I don't think is we've had enough of evidence yet, or enough kind of public discussion about how it's working to be able to make a really good long-term decision. So I would never suggest sort of abolishing them or ruling them out forever, but I think it's right that you can bring them in and out depending on the level of risk and the level of concern about COVID currently in the community. So it might be that we're at the stage with Omicron where we think, well, this is endemic, the damage to public health is manageable, and we're just going to live with this. And so it's right to phase out a whole suite of the measures that we've had in place, masks, social distancing, and health passes. It might be that we get a new variant cropping up at any time, as we could do, since we haven't got COVID under control throughout the world. And if that's more transmissible and or more deadly, we might well want to have a measure that we can put back into place, like a health pass, to say, well, we are doing everything we can to control the spread of this variant within our community.
All right, I mean, I'm afraid we have to stop it there, but Kirsty and Kate, thank you so much for joining Spectator TV. I'm sure we have lots more to talk about in future episodes. Now to politics. After the Owen Paterson fiasco, revelations about number 10 parties, the imposition of Plan B COVID rules, and slumping poll numbers for the Tories, we ended last year with the Prime Minister in a tricky position with his party. Has his standing improved, or could a new cost of living crisis bring the Prime Minister down? To discuss, I'm joined by the Spectator's assistant editor, Isabel Hardman. Now, Isabel, before Christmas, Boris Johnson was having a pretty torrid time. Now that MPs have had a couple of weeks respite from politics and it looks like Omicron is a little bit milder than maybe people feared, is he in a better place with his party?
He's certainly hoping he is. He's really been emphasising in his Commons appearances this week that he's not been introducing more COVID restrictions, which really would have been a way of just dialing back up the Tory wars straight away, straight into the new term. And I've spoken to quite a few MPs who have been long-standing allies of Boris Johnson, but who felt alienated from him for various reasons over, I'd say, the past year and a bit, who he's been making quite a lot of personal effort with. So he's had them in for Jake Berry told me that he went into Downing Street just before Christmas for what he described as a big session. And I think that was them talking about levelling up rather than really going heavy on the cheese and wine. But there have been others who have also had time with the Prime Minister one-on-one, where he's clearly been trying to show them that they matter. And that's something that's really important to Tory psychology. I've been writing about them for over a decade now, and I have to say that one of the easiest ways to alienate your MPs is just to not make them feel loved. And that was something that David Cameron really struggled with. It was often a bit like teenagers at a disco, sort of upset that someone hadn't looked at them enough. And so just paying them a little bit of attention is something that matters so much more to Conservative MPs than it does, for instance, in the Labour Party. And so it's interesting that Johnson clearly has realised that things are serious enough that he needs to make sure that people he probably assumes are his friends are still really on side. So there's that. But I don't think that things are going to be plain sailing by any means over the next few weeks. He still has a lot of issues. We've got the issue, which I'm sure we'll discuss, over the national insurance rise, which Jacob Rees-Mogg has been pushing for. We still have inquiries going on into the Downing Street Christmas parties. And Boris Johnson has been very clear that he's not going to be someone who is going to change. And so his enemies, those who are quite hoping that he does go, expect that the pattern of behaviour that they've seen over the past few months is just going to continue, and at some point again, MPs are going to be disappointed by Boris Johnson.
Well, let's talk about that Jacob Rees-Mogg intervention, because Jacob Rees-Mogg said at Cabinet campaigned against this national insurance hike, which had already been announced and decided, really. But Boris Johnson has more cost of living crises coming down the line, doesn't he? Because there's rising inflation, there's also these energy bills, which the government has said they're refusing to take away the VAT for. So all of these things, even without COVID, are going to be arguments within the party.
They are, and I think if you saw Conservative MPs agitated about partying in Downing Street before Christmas, it'll be on a different scale once a cost of living crisis really starts to hit their constituents and they get a lot of anxious communications in their email inbox and letter bag. And I think that's when things could get really serious for the Prime Minister, because if voters feel that their lives are getting worse under the Conservatives, then of course they're going to start looking for alternatives. And the next election isn't, it's not imminent, but it's not that far away either. And so this is something that Boris Johnson is going to want to get a handle on. But it, again, is something that's very difficult for a government to get a handle on. It's very difficult to control global energy prices, for instance. It's also very difficult domestically to control inflation, particularly if you're putting up taxes. And that's why this Jacob Rees-Mogg intervention at Cabinet this week is quite so potent, because Conservative MPs were pretty unhappy with the national insurance hike to, as ministers claim, fund social care, but really it's largely going to the NHS, and it's very difficult to see how it will stop going to the NHS in the next 3 years when it's supposed to switch to social care. But now that this cost of living crisis is with us and looming as a much bigger crisis, Conservatives are even more uncomfortable about putting people's taxes up. I think it's worth saying that Jacob Rees-Mogg has seemed to be on his way out of the Cabinet for a little while, not least because of his role in the Owen Paterson saga, which really kicked off Boris Johnson's autumn and winter of discontent. And it's been a question of whether he is going to be pushed or jump first, I think. He was reportedly very unhappy about COVID restrictions before Christmas, particularly when Lord Frost quit the Cabinet. And Boris Johnson may be seeking to do a sort of refresh of his top team and his Cabinet in the next few months. So he might be on his way out. He might feel that actually now is the time to use the firepower he still has as a Cabinet Minister to represent some of the backbenchers who he feels most at home with.
That's really interesting as well. You mentioned David Frost there as well. Do these people who are no longer in government pose a greater threat? I mean, now that there are more and more of them racking up in Boris Johnson's premiership. And also with David Frost, there's a particular Brexit angle there, isn't there? Because one of the reasons he cited for leaving was that Boris Johnson wasn't fully utilising the benefits of Brexit. And people might point to the energy crisis and say, now that he can abolish VAT on energy, he's not doing it. And that's one of the reasons, that's one of the symbols of not using the Brexit dividend.
Absolutely, yes. That's one of the very potent effects of Frost's resignation, is to highlight really promises that Boris Johnson made. And we had this highlighted by Harry Cole of The Sun at the press conference this week in Downing Street, where he pointed out that Boris Johnson had written an article in May 2016 about this VAT on energy bills. And now we have Conservative MPs saying, well, come on, Boris Johnson, you yourself said that this was something that if we left the European Union we could do. it just so happens that you could actually do it anyway if you were still in the European Union because policy has changed. But, whatever. The point is that it's something that the Prime Minister can do and isn't doing. And I think he's belatedly arguing that it would be a crude instrument, something that that wouldn't actually help the poorest. But I think something needs to change in the way that ministers and Boris Johnson approach this cost of living crisis, rather than just listing what they're already doing. Often you just need to sort of feed the beast and say, actually, there is something we can do. So we could take the green taxes that are on energy bills out of energy bills and put them into general taxation, for instance, which would hit the richest much harder than fiddling around with the energy bills themselves.
And Isabel, finally, I can't let you go without talking about your piece in the magazine this week, which is all about antivirals. Tell us about them and why are they important?
Well, it's really interesting because the vaccine task force and the vaccination programme have really become, I think, part of sort of Britain's cultural identity, haven't they? You'd see lots of people on Facebook and Twitter with their "I've got my COVID vaccine" little sort of avatars, and people walk around wearing their badges, which always reminds me of when I was like 5 and I'd just been to the dentist and I had a sort of gold star badge for brushing my teeth. But it's become sort of part of our identity in a way that the NHS has become part of our identity. We're proud of these things. We're proud of our vaccination programme. Most of us are proud to have been vaccinated. But the antivirals programme is also actually the biggest in the world in Britain. But it hasn't got the same cultural cachet as vaccines. And what it is for those who, like me, until I started writing this piece, didn't know very much about it, is at the moment there's 1.3 million people in this country who are deemed clinically vulnerable. And they can, if they get a positive PCR test, have an antiviral pill delivered to their home or get a friend to go and collect it from a nearby delivery unit. And if they take this within the first few days of getting symptoms or testing positive, it dramatically cuts the risk of them being hospitalised or even dying. One of the tablets this country has bought, I think, cuts it by between 30 and 50%. Another one of them, I think, cuts it by around 80%. So really quite dramatic results. And what it means is obviously people aren't in hospital, there's less pressure on the NHS in a hospital setting. There's also actually, it's much easier for GPs to administer one prescription of a pill than it is to take somebody into a tertiary setting. So it reduces the pressure across the board on the NHS, and it gives us a glimpse of COVID becoming an illness that we just deal with in the way that we deal with flu. So I interviewed the chair of the government's vaccine task force this week, Eddie Gray, about the programme. I interviewed the chair of the government's antivirals task force this week, Eddie Gray, about the programme that he's been running. And it's still early days. A lot of these drugs are still, we don't know what the sort of some of the end effects might be. I asked him about the impact of antivirals potentially on creating new variants, and he said that was something that they were obviously very alive to. I think a lot of people, when we talk about antibiotics, think about superbugs, and that's not quite the right language in the context of antivirals, but it is something that scientists at the SAGE committee are very alive to. But it could be a really important part of our programme for getting used to COVID as being part of our life rather than something that changes and disrupts our lives as it has over the past 2 years.
Well, that's incredible, and I hope it's as much a success as the vaccines task force has been. Isabel, thank you so much for joining Spectator TV. Nyrola Elimä is a China researcher living in Sweden. She is also a Uyghur, whose family are experiencing firsthand the Chinese government's persecution of the Uyghur people. She writes about what life was like in Xinjiang, the imprisonment of her cousin, and her mother's rather unique role in the government's efforts in this week's issue. And she joins me on the show now. So, Nyrola, you're joining us from Sweden right now, where you hold citizenship, but you were born in Xinjiang in China. Can you tell us, what was life like in China as a Uyghur?
I was born in Wulja city in Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. The life as a Uyghur in there usually is most of the job they will only accept Han Chinese, and for Uyghur people, sometimes the job application will just say no Uyghur. And then being a Uyghur also means you will face like daily discrimination all the time. But we arrange find a time to we survive. And then we try our best to be one of the best module Uyghur for the Chinese government, so we can have a normal life. But then things getting worse since 2009, and then it's also when it's the time then I started thinking maybe I should leave.
You mentioned 2009 there, and in your article you talk about that year how you were refused from hotels and even reported to the police for trying to get rooms in hotels as you travelled across China. That was also the year of violent clashes between the Uyghur and the Han Chinese and the local police as well in Xinjiang, which ended up with over 100 people dead, mostly Han. So it must have been a very febrile time when you left Xinjiang.
The protests start with a peaceful protest, but the government strike back really hard, and so the protest ended up as a riot. But the government said most people died as Han Chinese, but they never revealed how many Uyghur died in the next day and the third day, because Han Chinese people also went on the street and did the retaliation. So yeah, it was a tough time for both Han Chinese people and for the Uyghur people. But since the government started doing a lot of propaganda, repeatedly showing Uyghur violence face on the news and on the video, and then I start to feel like everybody look at us like we're some kind of potential terrorist, and these kind of things you will feel in the daily life. Wherever we go, we have to open our bag. Like a guard, they will check our bag, and then if we take on bus, they will do that. And when I go to the mainland, when I start to work at the mainland, and then I can clearly feel I'm not welcome there either.
And I guess here some context for viewers as well, which is that the Xinjiang region is so to the west of the country, and Uyghurs mostly live there. So for the majority of the Han Chinese, of which I am a member, you live on the other side of the country. You might never even come across a Uyghur in your life. You hear about Uyghur terrorism or Uyghur separatism, and then you see one on the streets, and all sorts of prejudices fly. So I think that is the very real sectarianism that's happening in China at the moment. And Nyrola, you say you and your parents made a decision for you to leave. Since then, it's got much, much worse for Uyghurs in this intensifying of the Uyghur policy, where you've got internment camps, you've got labor from these so-called graduates of the camps. And you write about your cousin, Nyrola, who has also fallen foul of the authorities in this policy. Can you tell us about what's happened to her?
It was 2018, March 2nd. Okay, sorry, let's go back to 2017 actually. 2017, around November, I received a message from my mother, told me she can no longer to contact with me anymore. And then I also received a message from my cousin, Nyrola. She also sent a goodbye message to me and to her own sister in Australia. So at that time, we already heard people are getting losing contact with their own family members. So I thought, okay, now it's our turn. But as long as my parents and my cousin and my relatives are safe or at home, I can accept the Chinese government doesn't allow them to contact with me. I can accept that as long as they're safe. But then in 2018, March 2nd, she disappeared. And it took me around 7 to 10 days to finally find out what happened to her. She was taken to the camp, to an internment camp, which Chinese government call as re-education camp, but it's internment camp, it's extradition camp. She was detained there for 10 months. And when she finally released, it was 2018 Christmas Eve. At that time, I even thought it's a miracle. Finally, she's home, and I even thanks to the Chinese government have the mercy on her. She's fine. She's home. But then later, I found out, which she told me, they starved her. She lost 13 kilo in that 10 months, and then she was diagnosed with liver damage. And then I thought, well, at least she's at home. At least she's at home fine, And then in 3 months, they took her again. And then they detained her in the pre-jail detention center for 17 months. And then they released her only for one night. And then they took her again. And this time, they sentenced her for 6 years and 6 months. That's how I lost my cousin.
And obviously the Chinese government says all of these measures are for anti-terrorism and anti-separatism. What do they accuse your cousin of?
They accuse my cousin for financing terrorist activities, which she sent money to her parents in Australia to purchase a house in 2013. And then government calls it as financing terrorist activities. With several journalists' help, I sent, and they also sent, they faxed the evidence can prove my cousin's innocent. For example, like bank transfer records and a house contract, everything to show to the Chinese government that money is indeed to purchase a house in Australia. But it doesn't matter for the Chinese government. You send money to abroad to purchase a house in Chinese government's eyes because you're Uyghurs, so you're terrorist or you're financing terrorist activities.
And what's particularly striking about your story, your article, is the different space that your mother occupies in this entire saga. Can you tell us about what she is doing?
They accused my parents for holding extremist items, and according to the police, the prosecutor documents, and according to the police, it was 66 pictures. They took they took in Malaysia when they were traveling there, and the government said is extremist items. And in relation to the Mayra's case, my parents has been under house arrest since 2019 April, and she can go out to buy grocery, but she's not allowed to leave the city. She's not even allowed to call her sister in Urumqi, in another city. So, yeah, but of course, even she was under house arrest for Chinese government, she's a perfect propaganda material they can use. So when they need her, they will take her to, have this kind of the propaganda agenda.
So, and that's because, as you write in your article, she loves singing, she has won competitions for it, and so they have been using her to propagate this idea of a happy, or singing or dancing Uyghur.
Yes, she loves to sing, and she won a lot of region award, and because she speaks perfect Mandarin, so for them she's a very module Uyghur, and they always ask her to talk about the importance for the Uyghur people show their gratitude to the Chinese Communist Party, to Xi Jinping, and it's important for Uyghur to remember how the party has been doing good for them. So yes, she became a propaganda mouthpiece for the Chinese Communist Party when they needed her.
How does she feel about that, considering the experience that your family has been going through? Or are you not able to, I guess, talk about this sort of stuff, given that you are in Sweden? Any communication between you would be through WeChat, I guess, which is a monitored social media platform.
To be honest, I never talked about this with my mother, because for her, what is the most important thing is she can take care of the Mayra's 3 kids. When the Chinese government took to Mayra, they not only confiscated her money, they also suspend the Mayra's parents' pension. So they left empty hands to her 3 kids. So for my mom, the most important thing is, what can I do so I can stay at home, take care of her 3 kids? Because my mom knows once they took, if she's not obey, then the Chinese Communist Party can take her. can take her. Chinese Communist Party can take her, take my father, and then these 3 kids will ended up in orphanage, or the state's sponsored boarding school for Uyghur kids.
Nyrola, what about you? I mean, you are in Sweden, and you're. I mean, I hope that you're relatively safe, but obviously speaking out against the Chinese government still will impact your safety. But are you not concerned when you're talking to media like us? For example, you've talked to lots of American outlets about your story. Do you worry about your parents, especially your mother, because they all know who she is?
Every time when I speak up, I'm worried and I'm scared. Every time before I speak up, I will have a lot of thought in my mind. Will this bring risk to my family? Will this bring disaster to my family? But then I also know if I don't speak out, they will continue to do these kind of things, not only to my parents, they will eventually come to my 3 kids. And then every time after I speak out, I always have a panic attack. You have to understand the Chinese Communist Party is very scary. I am afraid, I am scared, but I have to speak out. What is happening? The crime they did to my family, to put the innocent people in the internment camp, in prison. If I don't speak up about that, I don't know what will happen next.
Nyrola Elimä, thank you so much for joining Spectator TV. Now, from nuclear apocalypse to worldwide famine to now perhaps climate change, Lionel Shriver ponders in this week's issue why people, including her, are so obsessed with visions of impending existential doom. She joins me on Spectator TV now. Now, Lionel, I loved your column this week, which is all about the various ways in which people throughout history have feared how Armageddon might come. Tell us about it.
Well, I wasn't looking at from the beginning of time. I was thinking about the kind of rhetoric I'd been subjected to and threats to the world as we know it ever since I was a kid. And naturally, since I was born in the late 50s, I grew up under the shadow of nuclear war. And one of the things that I would have in common with my generation is having nightmares with some frequency about explosions of mushroom clouds. And it was terrifying. And then shortly after that was the population explosion. And easy to forget now, but it was widely predicted that we were going to exceed the carrying capacity of the land, and pretty soon we were all going to starve. I took the overpopulation thing very seriously. I've been interested in demography as a consequence for my whole life. It's been a fascinating field, partly because of what didn't happen. Nobody predicted the Green Revolution, which transformed the production of food, multiplied the production of food. And nobody expected that in the West, at least, population would not only level off, but achieve such a low fertility rate that it would start to, the population would start to contract. And that was not foreseen at all. And the column goes on to elucidate a host of other grave threats to our existence, including, of course, in the 1970s, it was predicted that the world was cooling and we were going to freeze to death. I mean, this is all by way of trying to achieve a little perspective on the present, which is always difficult to achieve at the best of times. And I'm just finding that all this climate change stuff, about which I have not positioned myself. I'm something of a neutral party, but I'm a distanced one. So I'm a little suspicious, this rhetoric of apocalypse. I've lived with it my whole life, and I'm still here, and so are you. So I'm taking it with a grain of salt.
I think everyone's probably got at least one of these concerns. Why do you think there is such a fascination with, catastrophic extinction events?
I think it makes life seem more urgent, more exciting. It makes the decisions we make now appear to be consequential. I think there's a mirroring in the apocalypse of our own mortality, so that, the very structure of our lives is apocalyptic. We recognize it. We're facing oblivion, believe it or not. And there's a tendency to project that small apocalypse onto the world at large. But I think otherwise it makes people feel more important. It puts everything at risk. And in the West, we seem to need that. If anything, we've grown more apocalyptic because our lives are so comfortable. We need to introduce peril, put ourselves back on the veldt and, out of the lounge chair.
Do you think it's almost a survival instinct? So not only this instinct to go with the crowd, but also to foresee potential problems and then use anxiety to motivate finding solutions?
Well, because there are interested groups who are promoting particular anxieties, and it suits their agenda. That's one of the things that I've been buffeted by my whole life, is various groups who have an interest in a problem. If you want to be cynical, you could say they are profiting from a problem, and therefore they want it to be as bad as possible. I was interested in researching my fourth novel, Game Control, which is all about a mad demographer. I needed to compare studies, what the population consequences would be in Africa in particular for the HIV epidemic. And there were any number of epidemiologists who thought that the population of Africa was going to plummet. And then there were the studies by the demographers, and they didn't think HIV was going to have the slightest bit of difference, and the real problem for the continent was escalating population growth. And to me, that was a revelation, because it was one of the first times I stepped back and looked at it and saw, oh, I see. These were sincere groups of people. They genuinely believed their research, though the research was slightly rigged in favor of their pet problem. But self-interest contaminated their results. And I think you see that with a lot of disasters.
Well, I guess also...
adopted disasters.
Sorry, Lionel, I was just going to say, I guess also specialising in a particular field without seeing the wider picture, perhaps.
Oh, we see that with COVID right now. All the scions of disease are, they're having their moment. This is great. And it's something in them doesn't want it to end, regardless of what they say.
Yeah. And how do we know which of these are real and which will pass with nothing happening? Because, some of them must be real concerns, but how do we tell which one is which in the present?
I think that's very difficult.
Yeah.
In the column, I acknowledge that not only are a lot of the problems that I cite real, but acting on a couple of them has ended up being beneficial and important. You know, the fact that we banned hydrofluorocarbons has made a significant difference to closing holes in the ozone layer. I am glad that we have brought in more stringent regulations for emissions in the air and water, so that by and large the pollution situation has improved. Not everywhere. If you go to Delhi or Beijing, you wouldn't say the same thing, but the West has, you know, in some ways literally cleaned up its act. And that was in response to alarm, which could have been interpreted as alarmism. And one of the things that made acting on pollution easier, though, is that you could see it. And I would say that on climate, we think we can see it, but I don't think so. That is, we can see it too up close. And now we're supposed to be looking at individual extreme weather events, and every single time anything happens anywhere that's a little out of the ordinary, then it's always climate change now. Well, I'm mistrustful of that.
And on climate change, you also say that you're mistrustful on the use of the word zero. Whenever that word comes out, it seems, is it too absolutist? Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think that the use of the word zero is a red flag of absolutism. So the zero COVID movement, like the zero population growth movement of my youth, not to mention the net zero policy, they all sound iffy to me, because zero is the mark of fanaticism.
Mm. And Lionel, finally, do you think that the media is also to blame? I'm aware of the irony of asking you this from the Spectator offices, but perhaps too often
we are
journalists...
the media.
Yeah, well, we can't resist a punchy headline, can we?
Clearly, the media are widely to blame.
Everything.
We seem to be in a time that the media largely speaks with one voice, and I think that's never healthy, unlike the Spectator.
Well, that's a lovely note to end on, Lionel. Thank you so much for joining Spectator TV.
It was my pleasure.
And finally, what happens when stars of Western shows come down with COVID? With a wave of infections over the last couple of months, understudies have had a more important role than ever, with some of them stepping in with only minutes' notice. I'm joined now by the actresses Kirsty Innes on the cast of Les Mis and Rachel Rawlinson on the cast of Six. So, Rachel, to start with, tell us what you do in your role as a swing on Six, this Western musical about Henry VIII's 6 wives.
Yeah, so the musical is called Six, and as it suggests, there are only 6 people in the show, and I cover them all, so I know the whole thing. Well, I say I know the whole thing. I have a lot of maps and charts, and I refer to my score and script before I go on. So yeah, essentially I could go on for any of the 6 wives of Henry VIII if needed. So if someone's off sick, or if someone's injured, or we actually have a 9-show week and everyone's contracted to do 8. So if it is someone's night off, I might go on. So that's essentially what I do.
That's quite a lot of roles and characters to remember. How do you fit it all in?
It is. But they've been brilliant at sort of, when we started, it wasn't, okay, here's the whole show, learn it, off you go. It was kind of a case of, right, we'll start with 1 and then we'll progressively build up. So now I've done 3. I have a 4th debut on Sunday. So we're getting there slowly but surely. But yeah, it's a lot, but the team are brilliant. Like I say, everyone's there to lend a helping hand, and there's other alternates, and obviously the queens themselves that can help us out. So yeah.
And Jenna, let me bring you in here, because you've been a cover for Eponine in Les Miserables, but over the weekend you had to cover for Fantine, which is not a role you were covering for. Is that right?
That's right, yeah. So I'm actually on the UK tour of Les Mis right now. I'm not in the West End production. So they got, just with so many people isolating and what's happening right now, they had to get a few of us in from the tour just to help cover the parts and things like that. So I was there as an understudy for Eponine, and then suddenly the second cover, Fontaine, went down. She was ill. She just couldn't do it. So the show must go on, as they say. So we had to literally just had an hour before the show just to run through things and to get it. And I've been singing it in the shower since I was 11. So I was like, I should be fine at this. Should be fine. Didn't really think it through. It was in the wings. I was like, I think it's too late to say no now. So and just did it.
Is that all the practice? And is that how you learnt the role through singing it in the shower? Like there was no studying beforehand that the production had art.
Not officially, because like you say, it's not a role that I officially cover. So it's not. I haven't had any rehearsals with MDs or haven't sung it through with anyone. It's just one of those, songs and bits and bobs that you kind of know. And because I've been in the show for quite a while, you hear it a lot and you see a bit of it, but doing it is a completely different beast. And it was absolutely, it was wild, but it was great fun. It was amazing.
How much notice were you given before they said?
Given about 3 hours notice. I got the call about 11 o'clock in the morning for a 2:30 show. And then I went into the theatre at 12 and had an hour's rehearsal. And then
I'm stressed just hearing about this. Rachel, I guess you're no stranger to the sort of last minute subbing on as well. Did you have to sub someone mid-show at one point?
I did. I was sitting in the green room actually doing some more of my maps, and we noticed that the alternate didn't come on for one of the numbers as Seymour, and I thought, should I be worried? And they were like, nah. And then suddenly someone came out, hello, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to have to stop the show while we have a quick cast change. So I ran, literally I honestly looked awful. It was a total transformation. Slapped on some makeup, did my hair, had like wigs and wardrobe on me. And yeah, you just have, like Jenna said with I Dream to Dream, you have this moment of like, I just have to trust that I know it. I had no time, because usually if I know I'm going on, I'll spend my train journey, going through the material and in the morning or whatever. But you just have to go, I guess I know it. We'll see what happens.
There's no other option, is it? At that point, it's like, you've just got to. You have to. So there's no point in panicking. Just go through it.
And typically, I'm sure this goes for all companies, people in the industry understand how stressful it is to be a swing and an understudy. So, for instance, that night I had 5 of the principal queens on with me. So I also had that reassurance of knowing that if I did go wrong, which I will add, I didn't. But if I did, I know that they would help me, and I can linger back and find the space that I need to be in. But I mean, I came off and I was like, that was the biggest adrenaline rush ever. So stressful. And there was one moment where, I don't know how familiar you are with the show, Catherine Parr sings a lovely ballad. Well, it's a ballad that goes into an up-tempo near the end, and we're all sat down and I'm doing my best acting, listening. But in my head, I'm fully just visualising where Jane Seymour goes for the rest of the show. I'm here, then I follow this queen, then I'm here, then I sing this line. What line am I on? So there's a lot, my eye's weeping. There's a lot going on in the brain, but it's a lot of fun.
Crazy. And Jenna, what is it like to be an understudy? Because I think viewers maybe have this image in their heads of All About Eve, where the understudy is constantly scheming to get the main role off in some way. I mean, obviously COVID takes that question out of the question anyway. But what is it like, Jenna, to be that understudy? I guess it's not as competitive, probably.
Really not. It's really, really not. And the women I cover are fantastic. They are brilliant. They're so supportive. And whenever they've got to go off and I've got to go on, they'll always message and send love and support and, have a great show sort of thing. And I really enjoy it. Kind of like what Rachel's saying, it's the last minute, the sort of chaos of it all I really enjoy. I've been thrown on mid-show as well, at interval, to do the rest of the Eponine track, which is sing her big song and die, which is quite... it's a bit of a whirlwind, but I quite enjoy that sort of quick pace, sort of any day, every day is a little bit different. It can happen at any point. I really enjoy that. And I hope I'm not a hunger study. I hope I don't come across as...
Is that what they're called? A hunger study?
Hunger study, yeah, you can get there. I quite enjoy that, but no, I really enjoy it.
And Rachel, do you find that sometimes, how do the audience receive understudies? Not necessarily you personally, but I mean, obviously there have been horror stories where the audience literally boos when the main actor that they've come to see is not able to be on stage. And obviously that puts the understudy in quite a difficult position.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think with Six, and I did Heather's before, they both have really big fan bases and they're super supportive and they are so welcoming. So actually when I came on mid-show as Seymour, I got a big cheer, which was lovely. But no, I think as well, there has been in the last maybe 18 months, I think more of a limelight put on understudies saving the show. And I think certainly if you're not in the industry, there can be an element of, oh, well, we haven't got the main person today, you know, we've got the backup. But actually, I think a kind of blessing from COVID, which, I mean, I'm sure there's not many, but one of the good things for understudies is you must have seen so, and I guess like this, like there's so many more opportunities for us to recognise that understudies and swings are literally saving shows. You know, people are able to see a show because of people like me and Jenna, because we, you know, Jenna is like, okay, I'll do a track I've never done before. Sure, we'll see what happens. Which I think is amazing. And I'm so glad that understudies and swings are, you know, finally being recognised for the hard work that they do. Because you just wouldn't have a show without them.
Yeah, there's this feeling that it might be like second rate sort of thing, but it's really not. Like, you know, like you say, you shouldn't notice when an understudy's on, and most of the time you don't, because they're so brilliant, because they'll just fit in perfectly, you know, and you don't notice if it's an understudy, you don't notice a dip in quality at all. And that's because, you know, understudies and swings, they know their job very well, that, you know, now finally they're being recognised a little bit and celebrated so much more. It's brilliant.
Well, Jenna, do you think moving on from COVID then, this is a lesson that the industry can take, which is just to give understudies a bit more breathing space, a bit more opportunities to show what they're capable of, instead of having the main star on, you know, 8 shows every 9 shows? Is there a way forward where, you know, you're a bit more dynamic about giving people opportunities to shine? Yeah,
well, maybe this could be a little a thing where they celebrate, or, you know, they announce it more, or they, you know, celebrate it on social media more, and say, you know, for this week, if someone's on holiday, you know, this week it will be, instead of it not like being a secret, but just kind of like slipping under, they should maybe make announcements and celebrate the fact, because, you know, backstage, like you'll know, Rachel, backstage it's very much celebrated, and, you know, and the company pooling together is fantastic, and you get so much support and love from all departments. So it would be nice for that to transfer out front, so that the audience can kind of do that too. The audience can show their appreciation and their support for the understudies too, because I'm sure they would love to if they knew it was happening. Because maybe you don't know it's an understudy. Maybe if you're not in the fan base, if you're not on social media and stuff like that, you might not know.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Jenna Innes and Rachel Rawlinson, thank you so much for joining Spectator TV. That's it for this week. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe to The Spectator's YouTube channel. Just click the subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon so you never miss an episode. Thanks for watching, and do join us again next week.